As war raged in Europe and Japan, delegates from all over the world gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to build a new global financial system. Through their creativity and collaboration, billions were lifted out of poverty all over the world, and the American middle class was created. But nearly a century later, it's time to recognize that the global economy has changed. We need a new system, one that builds on what worked, free markets and free people, and changes what doesn't. We need a new path for the future of capitalism, so countries can heal fractures within their own economies. From excessive inequality to job loss from technology, we need to win the race for the future of money. The rise of digital currencies, the long-term health of the euro and the dollar. We need to harness all the tools of economic statecraft, from using sanctions and trade policy wisely to reining in financial crime. Most of all, we need to remember what they knew in 1945. Economics, finance, and foreign policy are all part of the same story. This is a time to restore and rebuild America's collaborative economic leadership. This is a time for geoeconomics.
Good morning. I'm Josh Lipsky, the director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to the launch of the Bretton Woods 2.0 project. Now, 6 months ago, Secretary Yellen stood right here at the Atlantic Council and said from this spot that it was a moment for thinking big about the future of the international financial institutions. At the Geoeconomics Center, we took that message to heart. And today, we are proud to publish 4 major reports on ways the Bretton Woods system can be modernized in the 21st century. And we have chosen 4 key themes to focus on in the beginning of this work: governance and parallel institutions, the future of money and fintech, non-state and quasi-state actors, and new macro-critical challenges, including climate. But we believe deeply that reports and research, while crucial, are not enough. And that is why today we are also announcing a new fellowship, the Bretton Woods 2.0 Fellowship, to bring together the next generation of creative economic thinkers to help strengthen the international financial system for the enormous challenges ahead. Why now? Why this moment? Well, look at what is happening in the global economy. A cascading series of shocks, from the scars that never healed after the global financial crisis, to the pandemic, to supply chains, to surging inflation, to the war in Ukraine. It would be natural and understandable to focus on each independently and try, through institutions like the IMF and World Bank, to address them individually. But that approach would be a mistake. The lesson of 1944 and the spirit of Bretton Woods is that major international upheaval requires creative international economic thinking. The creation of the IMF, the World Bank, and the predecessor to the WTO all came in the midst of crisis. It was, as has been said before, a great burst of creativity. We need that spirit again. And that is the motivation behind the Bretton Woods 2.0 project. Today, we will hear from our paper authors and go through the beginnings of a blueprint for change. But before we do that, before we launch these reports, I am honored to welcome 2 leaders who serve or have served at the highest levels of the Bretton Woods institutions to help us frame this conversation. I am so pleased to welcome Ceyla Pasarbaşıoğlu, Director of Strategy, Policy, and Review at the IMF, and Professor Carmen Reinhart of the Harvard Kennedy School, former Chief Economist of the World Bank. Ceyla, Carmen, thank you both for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
So, Professor Reinhart, Carmen, I want to start with you and talk about this parallel institutions question that comes up so frequently. It was actually the first thing we talked about when we embarked on this Bretton Woods 2.0 project. You've been on the inside of the World Bank, now you're on the outside of the World Bank, and really the question is, and I'll put up a chart as well that shows this a little, this is emerging market public debt, but what is the role of parallel institution, parallel MDBs, parallel lenders, in the work of the World Bank, and could different coordination be possible between the bank And then I'll start with you, Carmen, on the bank, and then Chela, turn to you on the fund.
So I think the perceived threat that the sister Bretton institutions could be undermined, or the nature of the global financial system completely altered by these parallel institutions, I think at the moment those concerns are overstated by a lot. I have, as you know, a historical perspective, and if you look at the when the key Bretton Woods institutions have been critical and when they have been perceived as redundant, it varies a great deal on global economic conditions. The greatest self-doubts, say at the IMF, came after the Asian financial crisis, the Russian financial crisis, and the Argentine financial crisis ushered in a very quiet era in which the IMF, I think, and Chela can correct me, was doing a lot of soul searching, whether it really needed to downsize. We're at a moment where financing needs have skyrocketed as a consequence of the pandemic, among other difficulties being faced by emerging markets. As you pointed out, Josh, the global economic outlook at the moment is from uncertain to quite dim, which means financing needs are likely to be substantive. And then we have superimposed yet another role, which is climate finance, which is going to be with us for a very long time. In that context, I think the emergence of other institutions beside the core Bretton Woods do not really, undermine or reduce the global relevance of the multilaterals. I conclude by saying, as you know, I've written a lot on lending from China. Currently, for example, the number of loans in the context of central bank swap lines, for example, as assistance to a number of countries has increased significantly. Is that a substitute for the IMF, for the World Bank? I don't think so. I hope I've made the case we have great needs.
Yes, no, I thank you. And thank you, I think, for putting that context, because we keep hearing challenges, MDBs, parallel institutions. It's important to put that in perspective. And Chela, I want to turn to you. One, based on what Carmen was saying about the relevance of the fund and the bank at a moment of crisis, is that what you felt coming out of these annual meetings, which just are concluding now? And then second, I wanted to talk about innovation at the IMF. These are not the institutions that were created in '44. We all recognize serious evolution has come over the past 75 years, including at the fund just during the pandemic, most recently, and new facilities that were built. And so one, on the relevance of the institutions now, and then two, the innovations that you see happening at the fund at the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Josh, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and of course with my dear friend, colleague, Carmen as well. Carmen said it very well. Look, we have been going through many crises, right? I joined the fund in 1992. We were dealing with the aftermath of the Nordic banking crisis at the time. Then we had the Asian financial crisis. Then we had the emerging market crisis. But I must say, in my 30 years of career, I've never felt so many things happening at the same time and so much more fragility now than before. So I think we are in a very difficult juncture with geopolitical scars and how to manage that going forward. So I think the relevance of the institutions is even higher. There are other actors that we need to work with. Your introductory clip was very much on the spot on this. We have different players, different stakeholders that needs to be part of the discussion. And we also have different challenges. Right now, we have the current challenges of dealing with inflation, dealing with the implications of food prices, energy price increases. We have fragmentation that we have to discuss and address. And we also have, in addition to short-term challenges, we also have existential threats coming from the climate change, opportunities and risks from digitalization, inequality, and so on. So the challenges are high, and the institutions, as they have done in the past, have to adjust and work with different stakeholders, including other IFIs in our case, the private sector, and also, reaching out to CSOs, think tanks, and so on, because I really think the challenges we face are so different and so entrenched that we need everyone to think hard and come up with solutions going forward. What have we done at the fund? Of course, when we had the crisis, countries reacted very differently. We had extraordinary fiscal and monetary stimulus from all countries. For the advanced economies, this was 23% of GDP. For emerging markets and developing economies, somewhere 6% of GDP. For low-income countries, 2% of GDP. So the reaction to the pandemic was very different across countries and required support from international institutions. The fund lent within the first 3 months of the crisis to 88 countries. We used our emergency lending facilities. This was needed. We can discuss whether we can prepare better for crises going forward, but this was very much needed. So it was about 260 billion in new financing at the beginning of COVID. This took the form of emergency lending, increasing access to emergency lending. It took the form of precautionary instruments, and this is something we can come back to, which is very relevant at this point in time. These are very for countries that have good fundamentals, good institutions. And it also took the form of SDR allocation, the 650 billion SDR allocation, which of course has its critics and supporters. But most importantly, SDR allocation is a blunt instrument. Most importantly, rechanneling those SDRs into addressing some of the longer-term challenges. So the big addition to our toolkit, as you mentioned, the big innovation was the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. This is 20-year maturity lending. It's the first time for the fund, and it's macroeconomic policies and reforms to support MDB lending and private sector lending into climate transition in particular. So I'll stop there because I talked a lot, but happy to talk about some of these further, including the food shock window, which we again just introduced at the annual meetings. It's the third line of defense. We would really like to see concessional financing and grants. This would be from donors as well as from MDBs. But as a third line of defense, we're also prepared to help countries with their balance of payments needs. So I'll stop here, Josh.
Ceyla, thank you. And I'm glad you brought up these long-term challenges. That's where I wanted to go next for you both. And we can put up this chart. It's pretty striking, this global number of natural disasters over the past 100+ years. And I think my question, and Ceyla, I'll start with you and then Carmen, come to you, is how do you do it? How do you focus on these long-term systemic challenges to the global economy, to global health? Climate is one of them. Another pandemic is another. Emerging issues, fintech, while dealing with the immediate crisis, inflation. That was the #1 thing we heard about at the meetings, as it should be. But how does an institution like the fund or the bank balance both at the same time? Is it possible?
Yes, so this is an excellent question and a very difficult one. I think what we have been doing at the fund is looking at what does it mean for an institution like the fund? What is our role? How macrocritical are these changes? And you mentioned climate. Climate change has major implications. We need to think about our tools debt sustainability analysis, for example. This is a key tool we use to support countries. If we don't take into account the shocks from climate change and other macro-critical developments, then I think our tools are not necessarily adapt to the circumstances that we face. So for us, it's looking at our toolkit, analytical toolkit, looking at our even growth projections, right? We need to be mindful of what the climate change means for growth projections. So preparing and putting the resources in place in terms of the tools, analytical tools, and monitoring of countries. Then the second is financing. And I mentioned the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. What is our role in bringing the macro critical reforms, be it in the fiscal space or financial standards, and so on, that would bring in the much needed financing from the private sector. So I think for us, the key is that these, what we call longer term structural challenges, have a direct impact on macroeconomic and financial stability. And we need to make sure that we incorporate this in all of our work. Now, that of course means prioritizing very carefully, working with others. We work very closely with the World Bank on climate, on digitalization, which has huge implications. You had it in some of your slides in terms of how the international monetary system is going to work. You know, the digital currencies, central bank digital currencies, stable coins, and so on. So I think taking into account these, what one can say, I think digitalization is very much now, it's not so much of a long-term structural change, but these structural changes into what it means for fiscal and monetary policies and structural reforms and macroprudential policies is going to be critical. And we need to be very mindful of incorporating these into our analysis and our capacity building and financing, but at the same time, work with others to leverage as much as possible and to avoid duplication.
Thank you. And Carmen, to you on that point about working with others, from your perspective, being at the bank, has the bank done enough? Are they doing enough on this? And then the coordination with the fund, because I think that sometimes the question is asked is where does the role of the bank start and the fund end and vice versa on issues like climate?
So there's a lot of meat to your questions, but first I'd like to take issue with the chart you put up, Josh. I have written, with Christoph Trebesch and Sebastian Horn on coping with natural disasters and disasters in general over the last 200 years. I think, we have great challenges. We have great climate challenges ahead of us. But natural disasters are not new, they're just better documented also. Fair. And I think it's important to highlight that the multilaterals, the bank and the fund, since their emergence during the Bretton Woods institutions, the height of the Bretton Woods institutions at the onset of the post-World War II, became increasingly counter-cyclical. That is, when private capital runs out, official capital, both the bank and the fund, step in. And so I think that also creates a sense that the disasters have amplified, but in effect, our response also has amplified. Mm-hmm. I want to say a couple of things on the preparing for the next stage. And I think one of the lessons we learned from and this goes to your question of the fit of the bank and the fund. If you recall, the IMF was set up as an institution to deal with short-term balance of payments crises. That was the original mandate. And the bank was set up as a development institution to provide much longer-term lending for a variety of development projects, which have also since, the menu of those projects has expanded considerably over the year, and now taking into account, gender issues and inequality issues that were previously not tackled. So But let me say something about what we learned from the 1980s. From the 1980s, we learned that the short-term focus of the IMF, the BOP support, wasn't in many cases sufficient. That the problems were in many countries were more having to do with debt sustainability, with structural issues. And if you look at the evolution, and I hate, I'm doing self-advertising here, but I also did a paper on the history of the IMF with Christoph Trevish that speaks to this. Longer-term lending steps in at the IMF. I think it is very important to see that when you look at what the bank and the fund are doing, it looks like there is greater overlap, which is true, than before. I think the challenges that are being faced call for longer term longer term interventions, engagements by the multilaterals, and climate, I think, is the ultimate addition to that list. You're not going to solve transition and adaptation issues to climate changes in a short horizon. So I'm not really. I'm not concerned about the convergence in many respects that we're seeing in the two institutions. Let me conclude by saying that I alluded to earlier the fact that from a cyclical perspective, the global economy looks very troubling in terms of rising interest rates, declining growth rates. We don't have the Chinese engine of growth for emerging markets that we did after the global financial crisis, and countries have a lot of debt. So the cyclical situation looks bad. But let me also make the point, one of the things I emphasized at the bank when I was there is what I've been calling the reversal problem, which is, after several decades of making good headway into, development targets, poverty reduction, better distribution of income, convergence across countries, inroads on other social aspects. We're seeing a lot of setbacks, and it isn't just COVID. Even before COVID, the global commodity crash setback began a setback in a lot of the development markers. So I think the World Bank, as an institution, is also facing renewed challenges to make sure that the development markers do not continue to march backwards. I'd like to point out that 2020 was the first year poverty numbers globally increased since 1998. But let me stop there.
Carmen, thank you. And actually, on that point, I want to pick up on what's coming next in terms of cyclical crises and whether the bank and fund are prepared. And point taken on the chart, on the natural disasters chart. The next chart I'm going to put up, I hope you like better because it's based on your own research. So tell us if that aligns with your thinking. But here is the famous work you've done on currency inflation, domestic and external sovereign debt crisis, if we can pull that chart up. And of course, here we don't have data for the most recent years. You can tell us when we're expecting that because we're all looking forward to seeing that. But the basic question looking at this chart as we see it is, are the bank and the fund prepared? Jayla alluded to this a little, prepared for the next pandemic, prepared for the cascading series of shocks. We know the gloomy outlook right now. As you look at this, as we think about the challenges the bank and the fund have been through over the past decades and are likely headed into, and Carmen, I'll start with you, are the bank and the fund ready, or what else should be done so they and the membership support them in the way they need?
I think the COVID pandemic really set the stage for your question. And Chela certainly elaborated on this and you saw a lot of new activity, a lot of novel ways of thinking, also and lending and helping countries at the bank. The COVID pandemic really, and if the question you're also asking is, often a problem is during times of a lull in crises, institutions get complacent and sort of their wheels stop turning in terms of thinking out of the box to deal with new problems. We're not there now. I think the COVID pandemic and then subsequently the Ukraine-Russia war has really catalyzed ways of coping with new crises. Now, so I think there is readiness in the institutions to embrace a whatever it takes approach to deal with new crises. Now, the question is, are the G7 and the powers that be ready? At the end of the day, one critical, and Chela and I have been involved in this and written about this jointly. At the end of the day, if one of the casualties, if you will, one of the manifestations of the global turmoil is more sovereign debt crises, as included in the chart, we're going to have to find and this is not something that the IMF or the World Bank can do on their own. This is the ball is in the court of the big creditor countries. We have to find new ways of more expeditiously dealing in resolving debt crises. Debt crises lead to not just output collapses, more inflation, but they also create a lot of havoc, long-term havoc on political systems, on poverty, on inequality, all the things we care about in many countries. So, but the fact is, we don't have a good architecture to resolve debt crisis quickly. There had, the G20's initiative of the common framework was certainly a step in that direction, but it's yet to deliver a single debt restructuring. And this is an old issue. This is not new. This is a chronic issue. When I was at the fund in the early 2000s, Ann Krieger at the time was putting forth new ideas to deal with debt resolution. I think that's something. But I think that importantly, that ball has to be in the court of the G7, of China, who is the major global lender, of the big foot economies, not just the multilaterals. The multilaterals, can't cope with that on their own.
Well, Carmen, thank you. And Chela, that really ties into what I wanted to ask you about fragmentation. You've written about this recently, the risk of fragmentation, and what Carmen's talking about when you have the economic shocks, basically creating this feedback loop with the political shocks. And we see this now at the fund and the bank. We see tensions based on the war in Ukraine, inability of the G20 to even issue a statement, a communique at the end. So, my question to you, Chela, is how can the fund, from your perspective, do the important work it needs to do in this era of what we all recognize, increasing geopolitical fragmentation?
Yeah, so I just want to say a few words first about where Carmen left out. I think there has been good progress in resolving debt issues, right? We have, and it's interesting because the more you make progress, the landscape changes, and then you need to make even more progress. So with the private sector, for example, we have collective action clauses, and it seems to work well when it's the traditional bonded debt. But now we have syndicated loans or other types of private sector credits, which we do not have the instruments to deal with. The creditor landscape has changed dramatically in the last 10 to 20 years with non-Paris Club creditors like China, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, India, these countries coming in as large creditors. And the way it used to work in the past needs to be changed and needs to be to engage these new creditors. So the common framework was one important initiative. But as Carmen said, the Paris Club took a decade to get into action and start more expeditiously resolving debt treatments. It's going to be, unfortunately, the same in this case. And we do see some progress as we look at case by case. And for their part, China has been engaged and really participating in this. But unfortunately, the unfortunate issue is we don't have time. We are in the middle of increasing debt problems. 60% of low-income countries are either at this debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. That number is 25% for emerging market countries. So we are, I would think, in the middle of a situation where we do need countries to resolve these issues much faster so that we don't end up with the large costs that Carmen is talking about. I also worry about, and this is something we work with Carmen as well, a lot of non-transparency in terms of debt, both in terms of official debt, but also private debt. During the pandemic, we had many countries using regulatory forbearance. So there is opacity in terms of what is in bank balance sheets. We have the NBFIs, the non-bank financial institutions, which we had difficulties in even in countries like UK. So there are a lot of hidden leverage in the system, which needs to be sorted out. And that's always very difficult and costly. It is especially costly when you have fragmentation, because some of these issues, you need the global partners to work together to resolve them. And what the fund can do, three things, I'm going to just end with that. One, saying truth to power, basically doing good rigorous analysis, good multilateral and bilateral surveillance, supporting countries with the right policies, be it in debt, be it in the right fiscal policies, macroprudential policies, integrated policy framework with capital flows and FX interventions, and so on. So I think that's really critical. And my concern is the next hit to us is going to come on industrial policies that countries will start to resort to given what's going on. Second is lending, providing financial support. We talked about this. I'm not going to go into detail on this. And third is the convening power of the fund and other IFIs, especially the World Bank, on issues where global action is very much needed. And I think here on fragmentation, really looking at costs of fragmentation, doing the analysis on what it means and the costs for everyone. We talked about debt treatment. Debt treatment is important for, of course, the borrower, but it's also in the interest of the creditor. So bringing everyone around the costs and benefits of acting together, and at the same time, making sure that the interests of different stakeholders are thought through carefully, as we have learned in many crises in the past, right? We had in the 80s the Brady bonds. We had in the we had the Vienna Initiative when the European financial institutions had their own problems. So thinking through innovative and creative ways of dealing with the debt problem, but from the borrower side, but also from the creditor side. And I think this is really going to be critical. And I will end by saying it will only be possible if we also have improved governance in the international financial institutions. We have the 16th quota review that needs to be finalized by December 2023. And this is going to be critical to make sure that everyone feels that they are part of the system and take the leadership to do what is expected of them. Thanks.
Jayla, I'm really...
Josh, if I may
Please,
just
Carmen,
say, I mean, I think it's very relevant to this project. The Bretton Woods institutions came at the height of historic fragmentation. We had World War I, we had the Great Depression and trade wars during the 30s. We had World War II, and the founding of the Bretton Woods institutions was a way of gradually integrating. So I think, it speaks to the points Chela made of the important role played by these institutions in dealing with initial conditions at the moment that have worsened, but we're nowhere close to the point where the institutions were founded.
I had the same thought as Jayla was saying that, Carmen, of the greatest moment of geopolitical fracture breaking in the 20th century is when the institutions were born. And we always say, this new era of geopolitical fragmentation, but in some ways, and we're not at the point we were in the 20th century, thank goodness, but it's a return to things that the fund and the bank are not actually unaccustomed to dealing with. It just may be something that hasn't happened in more recent years. So we're almost out of time, but I want to end with a question, which is how we started the project with our roundtable group, with our authors. And basically, it's taking a step back on the Bretton Woods institution. There's an old line about the fund and the bank, that the bank was actually created as a fund and the fund was actually created as a bank. And of course, and Carmen, you spoke of, there's a little truth to that if you think about original purposes of the institutions. But the question we started this project with 6 months ago, and even before that, was if the IMF and the World Bank didn't exist today, if you were building them from scratch, what would you build, given the global economy we have now? What would those institutions look like? I think we would agree there's some need for international economic coordination, balance of payments, crisis, multilateral lending, but what would those institutions look like? So Chela, I'll start with you, and then Carmen, I'll come to you.
I'll give a boring answer, Josh. I think they would look very much like what we look like now, but with a governance structure that reflects the realities of the geopolitical situation. So I think that would be the key of bringing everyone together. But in terms of what we do, I think it would have looked very similar to what we have now, in my view.
And Jayla, and Carmen, before I turn to you, I just want to put up this chart we have here to your point on governance. This is part of our Bretton Woods project. We'll talk about this in a minute with the paper launch. But just the representation issues and some of the imbalances that need to be addressed for, I think, the future credibility, as you've said, Chela, for these institutions going forward. Carmen, I'll give you the last word.
So, look, I think one thing that perhaps if we were recreating them from scratch, we would perhaps be a little more careful, especially this is relevant for the IMF rather than the bank, of, separating out, if you will, certain close to global central bank functions that the fund has. The bank does not have this, but I think one obstacle that remains often for countries to approach the fund or the bank is overcoming issues of stigma. And so, and this is sort of like going to the emergency window of a central bank. And I think in perhaps recreating some of the facilities, maybe a broader range of differentiation to try to reduce the stigma from countries approaching, say, the fund for temporary versus, longer term lending. That's one area where we could probably improve upon. But on the whole, I very much agree with Chela that they wouldn't really look that different. On the issue of representation, I'm sorry, I hate to sound cynical, but money talks. And the fact that the representation of the big powers is so big in this institution reflects that this is where the money comes from. They are indeed the creditor base that support the system. So, if you have any better ideas on how to level the playing field there, I'm very open to them, but I'm skeptical. Let me just say that I think the difference in contributions goes a long way to explaining the difference in the footprint, in the voting, and so on. And that's, I think it's kind of Pollyannish, frankly, to think we can fully overcome that. On that dark note,
I will say that when, as you're saying that, I think you're maybe channeling some Keynesian spirit of 44, 43. I feel like those conversations were happening between the UK and the US at the time in terms of representation in these institutions. And Jayla, I just wanted to say, I really appreciate what you said about truth to power as well. I think such a critical role of the fund. I think certainly the fund did that even recently with the UK, and it doesn't matter who the member is, what the member is, the fund does that, and it serves an important role in the global economy in doing that. I want to thank you both. I want to thank you for your insights, for your leadership, for your willingness to participate in this, coming after an extraordinarily busy week of the annual meetings. This is a conversation we want to continue. I think if one thing comes across clearly, the importance of these institutions is clear. They're needed for the global economy, and they can continually be improved. So Chela, Carmen, thank you so much, and look forward to talking to you both soon.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Nat.
Thank you.
Hello, Chela, once again.
We'll do it in person next time. Thank you.
Indeed.
So it is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Amin Mohseni Turaglu, macroeconomist with us at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center. And Amin has led this work for us over the past year, along with our team at the center. And we are going to get into the 4 reports we are so excited to launch now, because we believe it's so important to have the tangible progress, the recommendations, the specifics of what Bretton Woods reform means. So Amin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Josh. It's been a great reward. It's been a great journey to be part of this project under your visionary leadership. I'm very grateful to our panelists here who has also co-authored the 4 reports for us. And they've been very generous with their time over the past 6 months, working endlessly to make these reports coming on time for today's launch. So allow me to introduce our panelists very quickly. We have Ajay Chibbar. Chibbar is a non-resident senior fellow at Atlantic Council and a former UNDP and World Bank senior staff member. Ajay has an extraordinary background in the public and public sector and international organizations. His paper is titled Modernizing the Bretton Woods Institutions for 21st Century. It outlines the need for 3 core R's in IMF and World Bank reforms: remit, resources, and rules, which he will touch upon a bit today. Welcome, Ajay, and thank you for joining us virtually. And then we have Hong Tran. Is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council with an impressive background in public and private sector. He is a former senior staff at the IMF and Institute of International Finance. His report is titled The Evolution of the IMF, a Case for IMF 1.5 Before Bretton Woods 2.0. In his paper, Hong argues for IMF 1.5 through more feasible and practical reforms in the short run, when more substantial reforms for IMF 2.0 are simply not in sight anytime in the near future. Thank you, Hong, for being here. And we have Nisha Narayan. She has an incredible experience in private sector as head of country risk. She was also a former World Bank consultant. Her paper is titled Changing Bretton Woods, How Non-State and Quasi-State Actors Can Help Drive the Global Development Agenda. In her paper, Nisha highlights the important role of non-state and quasi-state actors in global economic governance. And some of these institutions are such as sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, NGOs, and so forth. It's a pleasure having you here with us, Nisha. And last but not least, we have Victor Shi joining us virtually from California. He's an associate professor and Homyu Lam Chair in China and Pacific Studies at UC San Diego. He's an expert on Chinese politics and economic policies. I know you are coming out of a long week of following the news on the Chinese Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. So thank you for being here with us, Victor. Victor's paper is titled How China Would Like to Reshape International Economic Institutions. He examines different aspects of the satisfactions of China with global governance institutions such as IMF and WTO. He also discusses the underlying Chinese aspirations that drive proposed changes to these organizations. Thank you, Victor, for being here with us. So allow me just to jump into the discussion. Ajay, allow me to start with you. I know it's a hard question to ask, but what is your broad assessment of IMF and World Bank's performance over the past 75 years of their existence? Have they been successful in achieving their objectives of global financial stability, sustainable development, inclusive growth? What is your assessment on this?
So thank you. I mean, so my assessment is that, you know, Watts and all, they were fairly successful or pretty successful in the first 50 years after the Bretton Woods institutions were established. That there are problems, of course, in a lot of criticism of some of their actions, but overall, I think they provided the international kind of financial institution architecture to the system that helped global prosperity, helped countries come out of poverty, etc. But I think since the beginning of this century, I think that progress has stalled, and particularly I think with the global financial crisis, you get a sense that these institutions are no longer fit for purpose. First of all, they're just too small to deal with today's global problems. They've also been unable to mobilize global capital to address today's challenges, that they're focused too much on their lending and targets and not enough on what role they need to play in mobilizing much broader flows of capital. And then, of course, this issue of the representation, that even today they don't represent what's the sort of economic structure in the global economy. And certainly if you want to think about institutions for the coming century, then you need to think about where we will be in 2050. Now, the IMF, I think the biggest, I mean, I was listening to Jayla and Carmen, and they are, of course, great experts on this, but I think the IMF initially was set up to monitor, you know, exchange rate adjustments. It was a genuinely global institution. And what has happened is over the last 50, 60 years, it has become mainly an institution to deal with problems in developing countries. Its surveillance of in advanced countries is very weak and self-censored. So as a result, it has been its biggest failure, I believe, has been its inability to predict or deal with global crisis. There are lots of other problems with the IMF, which I won't go into in detail here, but I think that's the fundamental thing. It's not just one more instrument that they have to create to deal with climate change. It's that they are no longer a global institution. And this came through when they criticized the UK lately on its fiscal policy and got a reaction back. And I think that's the issue I think that we need to deal with. On the World Bank, I think Al Gore is right. It's completely missing in action on climate change. The World Bank president talks about $31, $32 billion in lending, but he should remember that in 2015, the World Bank issued a report saying we have to go from billions to trillions. So just lending $30 billion is a drop in the bucket to address climate change problems. And you know, in my paper, I also talk about the WTO, but for want of time, I'll just not go into that. So as you said, I have suggested, you know, a complete change in the system based on what I call the 3 R's: rules, remit, and resources. That the resources of these institutions need to be increased hugely if they have to deal with global problems, but then their entire system has to change so that they can catalyze even more resources going forward. So let me stop here. I mean, I could go on giving you more detail on my paper, but basically my sense is that what we need is reformed institutions which are genuinely global, with the IMF dealing with macro policy and financial stability. It should look into issues of climate change, but the last thing it should be doing is lending money on climate change. I mean, that's just like distracting itself. The World Bank should become the global institution for planetary sustainability and shared prosperity. And then, of course, I have suggestions on the WTO. But this should be part of a cascading system of support from regional institutions, from other important actors in civil society and private players, etc. That my paper lays out. Let me stop here. I mean, I don't want to go on.
Thank you, Ajay. Following on Ajay's comments here, Hong, in your paper, you talk about IMF reform. When you talk about IMF reform, you distinguish between feasible reforms and ambitious reforms. Why do you do that specifically?
Well, I think at the end of Carmen's and Shaila's discussion, they mentioned fragmentation and geopolitical tension and problem. And that is precisely the reason why we really cannot move very much ahead with anything structurally ambitious or big to reform this institution or to redesign them. I share many remarks that IJ just went through, but for those to happen, particularly increase the voice and representation of emerging market countries, which is now accounted for almost half the global economy compared with 75 years ago. China, of course, is the big elephant in the room, will be simply not feasible. The latest change in voting power happened with the review of quota back in 2010, finished in 2016. Yeah. China's share went from 3.8% to 6.2% at the expense of Europe and emerging market countries, whereas the US insists on keeping the same share, 16.7%, giving it veto power over important decisions. Given the hostility, the enmity, lack of trust between, on the one hand, the West, US, and Europe, on the other hand, China and Russia, I do not see any consensus agreement to increase the role of China even further. Mm-hmm. Increasing capital, again, is a big demand that we heard this week for the IMF and the MDB, but again, the lack of international consensus and cooperation will make that impossible. But nevertheless, reform and change are needed because of all of the reasons that we have heard so far today. And therefore, I focus myself, particularly with the IMF, which I used to work for, so I know the institution a bit better, or a series of more narrow in scope, more technocratic in nature, but feasible because it is within the competence of current management to push it and within the current envelope of resources without any demand for any new money. Mm-hmm. So basically we can go through them quickly, but those are things that so quickly, number one is very easy to do. Africa has been identified as the region that suffered the most, COVID, and then the war in Ukraine, food prices and food insecurity, even famine and energy prices. They need a lot of help. But if you look at the pattern of IMF lending, Latin America has 10 times more on average in terms of lending resources and size of program compared with Africa. One clear example, Argentina, in the past year, Argentina got another of the 20 plus program from the IMF, $44 billion, 1,000% of quota. Zambia, a few months ago, got another program from the IMF, 1.3 billion, 100% of quota, so 10 times more. So I basically just shift a little bit of resource from Latin America to Africa. You can increase the resources for Africa within the current resources envelope. Another thing that Jayla discussed and Carmen is the role of structural reform as conditionality for IMF lending. My argument is that going forward, there should be less structural reform as conditionality and more capacity building. Because basically, we have to remember that the IMF was launched 75 years ago to provide emergency short-term support to countries in balance of payment difficulty. It was not set up to change how country works via structural reform. So they should refocus a little bit. And another thing is that in the global financial safety net, which is now splintered among different players and different providers and layers between countries accumulating foreign exchange reserves, $7.5 trillion among emerging market central banks, and the major country like the Fed or the ECB, and regional arrangement like the European Financial Safety Mechanism or the Chiang Mai Initiative. The fund is now just one among many providers. But it can play a role because of its superb and expertise in economic analysis and understanding of the countries to provide a coordination role among those two different providers of emergency financing. Just by coordinating statements can have a very great calming effect during a crisis. So those are some concrete ideas that I'm happy to go into more later on.
Certainly, we'll dive in more deeply on those ideas. So Nisha, let me put up a chart here from your paper on the size of sovereign wealth funds and the regional distributions across the world. So in your paper, you examine a novel but a very important question that what is the role of non-state or quasi-state actors such as sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, even multinational corporations in global economic governance. How do you think these institutions can help IMF and the World Bank in the 21st century facing all these challenges? As Jayla mentioned, we need everybody to talk to each other, all the organizations and institutions, to solve these multifaceted challenges. How do you think these institutions can help IMF and the World Bank achieve their objectives in the 21st century?
Yeah, so I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I mean, the main objectives of the World Bank and IMF, monetary stability, poverty reduction, you've got all these emerging risks, food and energy security, and countries are still recovering from the pandemic, and their debt levels have risen to unbelievable levels where they're actually just trying to survive when all of these other external risks are now compounding their ability to survive. So what I looked at was, are there parallel initiatives, or as we talked about, non-state and quasi-state actors who are almost serving in the same role as the World Bank and the IMF, but just on a different level and to a different capacity. And with everything going on and with all of these risks that countries are facing, the capacity to finance in the long run can't be solely the burden of the IMF and the World Bank. We're going to have to look towards these actors to hopefully maybe fill the gap, or at least work with the IMF and the World Bank to create a more sustainable framework for financing and reducing these gaps. So I'll give you a quick rundown on the different analysis I did on multinational corporations, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and NGOs. So multinational corporations, their role in development has changed significantly in the last 2 decades. They have their footprint into emerging and developing countries has expanded, exponentially. Their revenue has increased, so their contribution to foreign direct investment in several of these countries has risen. And as we know, FDI is key to boosting growth. So, having a multinational corporation invest locally is actually very important and critical to, increasing sustainability within these countries. And one of the other things I also identified was that a lot of these multinational corporations are now starting to originate in emerging and developing markets. So this is important because they have the local expertise and knowledge within the country, and they understand the growth fundamentals and what is key to improving the different economic and political variables within the country. And so what I saw was that this is actually boosting GDP within the country. And so being able to see that emerging markets and developing markets are actually contributing to global GDP is actually, very important. And then, one of the other things I identified was that multinational corporations are now more critical in the sustainability discussion. So climate change has become a very important topic, especially with financial institutions and also corporates. And so we're seeing them incorporate these standards, not just at home, but also within their global operations, so in emerging and developing countries. And this has become important because they're actually making an impact on ESG in parallel with the World Bank and IMF in terms of like what they're trying to do for the future. So, I could go on about multinationals, financial institutions. They are very important to emerging and developing countries. They introduce liquidity, credit. They open up market access, more banking products like retail banking. So this is helping growth within the country, and also financial technology. Fintech firms are starting to grow and are very important in a lot of these countries like Brazil and India, for example. Fintech has become a very important sector, and we're also seeing top asset managers from outside of emerging and developing countries invest in these sectors to help those countries actually boost growth. I'll move on to sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. So as you saw in the graph, the sovereign wealth funds and pension funds, their net worth has grown almost as much as multinational corporations. And they have also evolved in terms of how they're investing. So they're starting to look at more hard assets like renewables and infrastructure. So this is really important because the infrastructure gap has widened and is continuing to widen, not just in emerging and developing markets, but also developed markets. And being able to tap into these resources would be key to reducing this gap. Sovereign wealth funds, their main objective is to help protect the home economy and protect future generations. But we're also seeing more of a transition to investing in other emerging and developing markets that are struggling. So, with the food and energy crisis, we're seeing sovereign wealth funds investing in countries that are suffering or bearing the brunt of it. And that's really important too because they're contributing to growth, but not just at home, but also abroad, and helping reduce this gap. And then, of course, NGOs. This was an interesting topic because when you typically think of NGOs, you think of some of the large nonprofits that go in at times of crisis. But with the technology boom, many of the CEOs of these large technology companies have become champions of the developing world. And, I'll give an example that we've talked about before, the Gates Foundation. They, and not just as a result of the pandemic, but they've become more critical. It's become more critical in terms of helping finance vaccinations overseas and trying to help reduce the effects from health crises. And so, you're seeing another area of untapped funding that should be either used in parallel with the World Bank and IMF, or, collaborate with them, or, help integrate their funding within the framework. Another policy recommendation I had was just, incorporating their expertise and knowledge, like their on-the-ground expertise and country-level knowledge into, World Bank and IMF consultations, initiatives, and thematic funds, just to get a better understanding of, countries, like the comprehensive profile of a country, like what's the investment level, how much debt do they have, and where is the lending coming from, basically incorporating and integrating these actors into that discussion will give a better, more accurate picture. And it'll also, in the long run, help with improving how the World Bank and IMF function.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll dive into the issue of ESG and active investors later on as well. So Victor, in your paper, you examine China's view and role in global economic governance. As we know, governance structure of Bretton Woods institutions is not democratic in terms of per capita wise. I know Carmen mentioned money talks, definitely. But when it comes in terms of per capita, the picture is very much skewed. For example, China, for the case of China, 170 out of 189 member countries of the World Bank, they have higher voting rights per capita wise at the World Bank's IBRD. With this background in mind, what are some of the ultimate objectives of China's continued engagement with global economic governance institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, and WTO?
Yeah, no, first of all, thank you for having me as part of this project, Amin and Josh. Really a pleasure to be here. So indeed, I think China's objective right now is to move from what they call hegemonism. So hegemonism is the traditional dominance of Bretton Woods institutions by the United States, but also close allies of the United States, like the UK and some of the Western European countries, to another state of affair, which they call internationalism, which is a more even distribution of power and resources through the international economic institutions. So, obviously, as Hong Trung already mentioned, China has made some progress, especially in the IMF with higher voting shares. And then, if you talk to sort of people from China who work at the IMF, they will say that representation in the senior management of the IMF also is an important objective, certainly for them, but also, for the Chinese government, that they would like to have more managerial control over some of these institutions, like the IMF, like the World Bank. And we've seen, of course, over the years, pretty strenuous lobbying by the Chinese government to make that happen. And as Carmen Reinhardt pointed out, I mean, a lot of this at the end of the day is about money, right? And China has been willing to contribute quite a bit of money, tens of billions of dollars into these international economic institutions, where China has found a lot of frustration, and where I think China is seen to sort of go around the traditional institutions is on the trade front. So China, even though, of course, China has been, I mean, arguably the single biggest beneficiary of the WTO, with the signing of WTO, you clearly saw this massive spike in Chinese export, and which of course led to less manufacturing in the United States and in other countries, as my colleague Gordon Hansen pointed out. So, China has benefited from the WTO historically, but now China has found what they would see as obstructionism by the United States, especially the United States in the WTO, very frustrating. There are not enough judges now in the appellate body. The Doha round, in China's view at least, ended in complete failure because of obstruction by the United States. And in response to that, China has sought to sort of go around the WTO with regional trading agreements, or with kind of encouraging more formalization, more rulemaking in a lot of regional trading agreements. Of course, most recently, China was very enthusiastic in supporting and in joining RCEP. But also, if you look at organizations like the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, SCO, and ASEAN, China also has really encouraged. First of all, SCO, of course, formed originally purely as a kind of a security arrangement, but now has taken on some of these non-security, more strictly economic roles. And in the case of ASEAN, obviously China has been a very willing participant and has tried to encourage the ASEAN to formalize some of its role in terms of trade, in terms of even financial transactions. So I think, but at the same time, I think in this dollar-dominant world, which we still live in, and of course, China has not had a lot of success in internationalizing the renminbi. On the financial front, I think China has no choice but to mainly work with the existing Bretton Woods institutions, especially the IMF, especially at a time when we're going to have a bunch of defaults by developing countries. Many of them owe China hundreds of billions of dollars. I think working with the IMF is really very much to China's advantage. But on more of the trading front, I think this is where we're going to see China try to break out and try to do things on its own away from the traditional Bretton Woods institutions.
That's interesting, Victor. Ajay, if I may come back to you on the question of resources that was mentioned by Hong and also Nisha, and was also mentioned by Jaylan and Carmen as well. It's a very important question, and that's one of your R's in the paper. Can you suggest some specific reforms within IMF and World Bank that could lead to mobilization of private capital to finance some of these gaps in global financing of infrastructure, global public goods, and climate adaptation and mitigation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just since Hong mentioned about WTO, Victor mentioned about WTO, let me say my paper covers WTO also in quite extensive detail. And he's right that China is unhappy with the US position on the appellate court and the tribunal. But at the same time, you know, there's another bigger issue there, which is China's self-attestation as a developing country and the role of SOEs in state-owned enterprises in kind of a market economy system and all the implications of that. So it's a complicated issue. While China may have a position on it, but at the same time, the rest of the world feels China has unfairly used the WTO system also. So I just thought I'd put that there because that's in my paper as well. And I didn't get into WTO issues too much because we were focusing on the World Bank and the IMF. But coming back to the bank and the fund, I think, well, first, let me say about the World Bank. And this applies not just to the World Bank, but probably applies to the regional MDBs as well, that they have been overly conservative in the use of capital. That, you know, their equity to loan ratios for, if you take all the multilateral banks, the regional banks and the World Bank, and despite the fact that they have sovereign capital, so you have paid-in capital and you have callable capital that forms the capital base of these institutions. Their equity to loan ratios are more conservative than any commercial bank out there. So you sort of wonder how is it possible that you have been so conservative in order to maintain your AAA ratings, et cetera, that your equity loan ratios are more conservative than any commercial bank out there, which is, quite amazing. And then the other thing I think is that when the World Bank was established in 1946, it had two instruments for support. One was loans and the other was guarantees, and guarantees including backstop facilities for insurance products, etc. And what has happened over time is that you find that it has not used those guarantees and insurance instruments as much as it has focused on lending. And the simple reason for this is that when you book a loan, you book it, say you give a country 100 million, then 100 million is booked against the credit of that country. If you give 100 million in guarantees, they book the same 100 million, which means even if the probability of your guarantee being called is, say, less than 10%, the country still ends up getting booked 100 million. So the country thinks, why would I not just actually take the cash if I could have that, rather than have a guarantee which is going to be booked the same way in my loan book. So this is very important because you can think of a way, or like as I argue in my paper, an Archimedean lever, where you could take 10 million or 100 million and, at least, expand it 10, 15, 20 times. This can be done through implicit guarantees and it can be done through explicit guarantees. Implicit guarantees in the sense that if I know that the World Bank is going to support a particular set of operations for a certain amount of money, I can then, and going back to Nisha's paper, I can then draw in at least 5, 7, 8, 10 times that amount of capital for that operation, piggybacked on the project development and the technical work that has been done by the World Bank. As a World Bank manager, I've had 25 years of operational experience there. It's been done so many times. And the question is, why doesn't that happen more often? The other is insurance. The first insurance guarantee that the World Bank provided was 50 years after it was set up, which was amazing, given that the needs out there for disaster insurance, for climate risk insurance, for all kinds of insurance are so huge. And this would be a way to draw in very large sums of private capital from outside. So you can have reinsurance guarantees, etc. So there's just so many ways in which this can be done that I point out in the paper in more detail. There's a lot of focus these days on MIGA, which is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency of the World Bank. But people have to realize that it largely provides political risk guarantees. Political risk guarantees are a very small part of what is required. What we really focus on is project risk guarantees and policy risk guarantees that are available. So I think this all has to be looked at. I think that it's being looked at now, and my paper certainly points to that. On the IMF, I think the IMF, of course, as Jayla said, I think that the convening power is also huge. And especially for debt restructuring, I think the IMF should be commissioned now to have a much better debt restructuring framework than the common framework that Carmen was also talking about. And this is very badly needed because there'll be at least 40, 50 countries, as my paper points out, that are likely to require not just restructuring, but actually serious debt reduction if they are to be able to move forward. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Ajay. We are almost running out of time, so I'm going to ask our panelists to quickly, if they may, answer the following. Hong, you'd mentioned about removing some of the conditionalities or reducing them. What are some of these conditionalities that the IMF imposes or requests the countries that are in their program, and why do you suggest that they should be reduced?
Well, the IMF has been quite correct in identifying these structural impediments as key obstacles for the country to grow in a sustainable way. Things like features of the economy that cause savings to be very low in many countries. Things like over years, populist governments tend to increase transfer payment, welfare, and generous pension well ahead of the ability for them to generate and collect tax revenue to fund those programs. And over years, they become structural in the sense that it's difficult to reduce the benefit and also difficult to increase the tax. Those need to be reformed and changed. But we have seen over the past 70 years is that it has to be driven by the country themselves. From the ground up, it needs the country between the far-sighted and competent leadership and the citizenry, the people supporting those changes to implement the change and have the country prosper. And there are few in terms of countries over the years able to make that break and become prosperous. Most have failed. Mm-hmm. And therefore, taking it as a sad reality, the fund, while conceptually correct in pushing for structural reform, in reality, most of the fund program failed after a few years because country, after signing up to the fund, get the money, 3 years later, things were more or less where they were 3 years earlier where the crisis broke out. At the same time, by pushing for intrusive, extensive structural reform reaching well into society and how they work, how they operate. The fund has acquired a stigma. Countries tend not to come to the IMF because they fear of the stigma. They try to do things on their own until things are late. The crisis is breaking out, and then the cost of curing the crisis will be much more expensive than otherwise could be the case if they come to the IMF early on. So that's why I say realistically, conceptually, the fund is right, but realistically it has been a kind of a failing approach. So pulling back, the mission of the fund is to fund short-term balance of payment shortfall by either the country using wrong policy over value exchange rate, so fix that, change the exchange rate, or spending too much, try to reduce some of the spending, but leave a more intrusive, more embedded feature of the economy, more or less for the country to deal with. They can point out analytically, these are the things wrong, you need to fix them, but do not make them a condition for existence. Instead, they should enhance capacity building. And I think Nisha is quite correct to say that technology, fintech in particular, is a really important thing for the IMF to help the country to improve their fiscal operation, collecting tax, make sure that it is fair, sending out the benefits, making sure that it doesn't being siphoned off by corruption, going to the wrong recipient by using fintech. Look at the case of M-Pesa in Kenya. Look at the case of hundreds of millions of people in India now being included in the banking system. These are the things that has been enabled by technology and fintech. And the fund can really help country, fiscal, ministry of finance, tax authorities, and so on, to improve their capacity in delivering the right mixture of policy to increase the efficiency of those fiscal operations. I think focusing on that would be important. Just two quick remarks. One is on capacity. The IMF, difficult to get countries to agree on an increase of quota during this current review of quota ending December next year, like Jay Lam mentioned. But I think that the board of the IMF should really allow the fund to borrow in the international capital markets, issuing bonds, the same way the World Bank, IFC, IDB, and so on have done for years. And the IMF, with sterling credit rating AAA, with the preferred creditor status, will really have ability to issue international bonds at a very low rate, and they can turn around and lend those money to countries in need, charging somewhat higher rates to cover the expenses. But I think that would be a very technical but important way for the IMF to raise their capacity. And last but not least, the need to differentiate between the IMF and the World Bank is very important. We are in a situation where money is needed, more things are needed, and therefore each institution should really focus on their core competency. And I agree with IJ completely. The MDB, World Bank together have a 1.5 trillion overall balance sheet. They really should do the climate financing, not the IMF. The IMF should focus more on the analytical power of the IMF, looking at the macroeconomic impact of not doing anything and the cost and benefit of different alternative policy to address the problem. So that will be clarified between the two, making both more effective.
Okay. Nisha, you touched upon this issue of MNCs and ESG. Can you elaborate just a little bit more on, given the emergence of shareholder activism, the rise of ESGs, impact investment, investing in MNCs, what is the role of MNCs in helping Bretton Woods, especially World Bank, as we just mentioned right now, in delivering some of the SDG goals?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned a little bit about how multinationals are incorporating sustainability goals and ESG into their operations. But there are a few reasons for this. And as Amin mentioned, shareholder activism is one of them. Shareholder activism is putting the spotlight on MNCs and holding them accountable for meeting ESG goals. And we've seen in the last few years the number of shareholder resolutions focusing on climate change and diversity and other ESG issues rise. And also the investments into those areas have risen too. And so this is key because it's almost like a checks and balance. You have people who are invested in these multinationals that, are focusing on ESG and holding the company actually accountable for it. So, if something goes wrong, they actually have to make a change, because there are individuals that are that have a stake in that company are pushing for that. And then also, there is no common regulatory framework for ESG right now, but there's still a lot of different initiatives, especially within other multilaterals and international organizations that have integrated the expertise and knowledge from multinationals into their benchmark creation, establishing metrics on how to measure ESG and sustainable development. And so this is really important because, this type of knowledge is not something, you can get just by doing research and, looking at analyses of countries. This is really important because these are actual companies that have to implement ESG and sustainability. And, one of the other things that I looked at was how reputational risk is changing multinationals, especially related to ESG. There's a lot of research that highlights and, puts multinationals in the spotlight, for their responsibility in carbon emissions. And, when this is reported on, these companies actually have to, be accountable and make changes. And we've seen that with some of these top multinationals that have actually been reported. And they've created different initiatives and projects that, are going to help reduce the carbon emissions and the carbon footprint in their operations in mostly emerging and developing countries. And then lastly, I'm just going to mention NGOs a little bit, just in terms of impact investing. So they've taken a key role in impact investing. A lot of high net worth philanthropists are channeling money into some of these NGOs that focus on data integrity and accuracy of data within, some of the regions like Africa and Latin America, and looking at how, what is the actual situation within that country in terms of food security or in terms of climate change. And these NGOs are critical because, we need that data. We need that information to paint a more comprehensive picture of what's going on within that region. And so the fact that there's more money going into it, especially from these high net worth individuals, is really great because it's going to, push for change. And so just quickly, the World Bank and IMF should be using this knowledge and these initiatives to develop benchmarks, develop, more accurate standard benchmarks for ESG and climate change.
Yes, indeed. Victor, going back to China, is it correct to assume that a lack of adequate and meaningful reforms in terms of representation in IMF and the World Bank has led China to embark on the BRI project or the establishment of AIIB or the BRICS Bank? Or would have China just established those banks independent of its role and representation at IMF and the World Bank?
Yeah, so again, I think you see different strategy when it comes to finance related international activities and trade related activities overseas. For finance, China cannot loosen its capital account, or it's going to have to massively devalue. So has no choice but to stick with these dollar-based IFIs like the World Bank, like the IMF. China, like Western lenders, are now finding out that fundamental divergence in total factor productivity, which is affecting balance of payments, really matters. Especially when global interest rates are high, a lot of these countries are going to default. Someone's going to be left holding the bag. And China doesn't want to hold a lot of this distressed assets on its own. So it has no choice but to cooperate with the IMF and other global institutions. On the trade front, I think China has a lot more leverage because China is the largest trading country in the world. It has the world's largest industrial manufacturing base. So it can very much throw its weight around and try to build up some of these regional trading blocks. cooperate with other existing regional trading blocs. So I think that's where China is really trying to expand its global influence.
Thank you. I guess we have to leave it at that. We could talk about IMF and World Bank and WTO reform for all day, all week, but the time is limited. I'm going to pass the floor back to Josh Lipsky, and thank you all for being here with us today.
Well, thank you, Amin. Thank you for your leadership of this work. And I want to thank our 4 fantastic authors who poured their time and energy over months into this project. Ajay, Victor, Nisha, Hung, thank you. You have helped us launch the Bretton Woods 2.0 project today, and it could not have been done without you, and we are grateful. And you can find all of their work, these reports, all of our data visualizations at the Bretton Woods 2.0 project at the Atlantic Council. The links have been dropped in the Zoom. We will share them with everyone after. So look, today is the beginning. It is not the end. I mentioned Secretary Yellen's speech 6 months ago at the Atlantic Council, standing right about where you are, Hung, a few inches away. In that speech, she reminded all of us that the planning for Bretton Woods began as early as 1941, before the US had even entered the war. So the hard work to deliver tangible change, it takes years. But we are committed to helping move that process forward, and I think today was a step in the right direction. Finally, I want to thank the dedicated team at the Geoeconomics Center who have made this work possible, especially Mugrank Busari and Naomi Aladakoba. These are 2 young people whose passion and interest in building a better Bretton Woods system should inspire all of us in this project in the days ahead. My thanks to the teams across the Atlantic Council, events, engagement, editorial, publications, who helped us build toward today. Thank you for being with us. Have a wonderful week.